Karl is a standard specialist at the Project Management Institute, responsible for the development of organizational standards and for coordination of PMI's national and international standards. He acts on behalf of the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, as the Secretary of ISO, TC 2584 Project, Program, and Portfolio Management. He has worked in a variety of positions while he has written multiple papers on the subject of best practices in standards development. Karl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marius. I've been introduced. My name is Karl Best. I work for PMI at GOC. So part of what I want to talk about today is PMI's perspective on the international standards efforts and how that relates to PMI's own efforts for standards development internally. I will also not attempt to speak any Greek. I can read a few words of Homer, but that's as far as we go. So I won't do any more than that. Miles and I have been working together for nearly 7 years now. It's been my privilege to work with him. He's been an excellent chair for our technical committee. He'll be stepping down at the end of this year. So our meeting next week here in Athens will be his last as chair of our technical committee. But I think we've got accomplished quite a bit over the last several years. So I'm very happy to talk about that. Let's see. Does this go anywhere? I don't have slides. Anyway. Do you have my slides? Yes, I sent that in. We're apparently without slides. Okay. 1 minute, I will grab my laptop so at least I can look at my slides myself and know where I'm going. No matter. If you can follow along without slides, then at least I can use this as an outline to tell me where I'm going, if I can remember my password here. Yes, you're correct. Risk management. We know how to do this. And actually, Miles and I were discussing or covering similar topics in our slides, so a lot of my slides you probably don't need to see anyway. So, Panos, this morning in his presentation, talked about some of the elements of project management, and I remember from one slide he listed that people, processes, and organizations are 3 aspects to project management. And I was looking at that thinking most people would say that standards would apply to the processes, that standards are used for defining the processes we use for project management. But I'll also suggest that project management or the standards we develop around project management also applies to both the people as well as to the organization. So all 3 of those aspects of project management are covered by standards. So the people, We are defining standards related to competencies, to training, both within PMI and ISO. Obviously, the processes are covered by ISO standards such as 21500 or from PMI, the PMBOK guide. The organization, not yet something that we've been talking about at ISO, but this is something that we've been talking about PMI, and we're beginning to develop standards there. So in my work at PMI, well, I split my time between ISO and internal PMI standards activities. So, you know, half or a quarter of my time is devoted to acting as the secretary of the ISO-TC. But I'm also managing a number of PMI standards committees. So any of you who have participated in PMI standards committees or as a reviewer, you know the sorts of activities that we're pursuing there. So I'm currently working on OPM, OPM3, Agile, recently completed construction, few others. So I work on a number of standards there. So we know about the PMI standards around PMBOK guide, standard for program management, portfolio management, the practice standards related to some of the knowledge areas that are in the PMBOK guide, and now also some extensions to the PMBOK guide, and a new family of standards we have around or the practice guides, which are more of a how-to approach rather than the what that we would normally find in a normal standard. And some of those topics overlap with what's been done at ISO. So for example, the PMBOK guide and ISO 21500 have some amount of overlap as far as certainly the scope, but the depth, the PMBOK guide will go into much further depth with the knowledge areas, the processes, tools, and techniques, and so forth. So, okay, so I have slides now. Okay, thank you. So let me then talk about ISO 21500, and Miles has discussed some of this already, but I'll go over some of it briefly as well. So this was initially developed by a ISO committee called PC, or Project Committee 236, which was the predecessor of TC 258, which we have now. And this was developed by participation from about 30 different member countries. In ISO, the members of ISO are the countries, and then each of the countries will send delegates to represent that country's national interests or that national position. And so ISO 21500 was developed by about 30 different member countries, and it was based on contributions from a variety of sources. So we took some sections from BSI 6079, and then as Miles mentioned, we took the Chapter 3 from the PMBOK Guide 3rd edition. I think we also used some of the glossary terms from the PMI lexicon. And we ended up with this standard developed by different working groups, as Miles also mentioned. We've got terms and definitions. We have some of the concepts around strategy, environment, governance, and so forth. And then we have the processes. So we divided up into 40 different processes that a project manager could try to use and group them into subject groups and process groups. Which button to push? So I think one of the significant things that we accomplished with 21500 was not just publishing a standard, but the fact that we now have a ISO recognition, or ISO has recognized the practice and profession of project management through this standard. So we have some additional credibility for this profession and for this practice that perhaps didn't exist previously to that. But we've also got, we have guidance for a consistent application of the practice of project management globally. And we've provided a pretty good overview, guidance on how to do project management. And again, this represents the input from quite a number of different countries. It's always possible to create a national standard or an industry standard, as Miles has pointed out, that represents that one particular viewpoint. I could write my own standard. I could create a karl standard. But I don't know if anyone of you wants to use that, because that represents only my opinion. or a company can develop a standard. That standard will represent that company's opinion. In this case, we have an international standard that represents the inputs from 30 different countries. So we have a global perspective, we have a perspective across multiple industries. We've created a standard that should be very broadly applicable to multiple industries, multiple countries. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everybody has to use it exactly as we've written it. There's always the opportunity to customize or to tailor that standard and make it apply to your specific situation. So what we've produced is something that we believe applies fairly well to lots of projects across lots of different industries and countries, but then you should take that and make it work for your specific situation. Now, back to PMI. PMI's mission, as you know, is to promote the practice and the profession of project management. And PMI as the, did I just lose sound? PMI as the largest player in the project management profession. I think he just lost it too. Yes, we're having a great day with IT, aren't we? There we go. Okay, are we back on again? Okay. Let's see, what else can go wrong here? Yeah, for sure. Okay, so PMI's mission is to promote the profession and practice of project management. And PMI, as the largest professional organization in this field, has a great deal of responsibility to promote the profession. And PMI has always recognized that having an ISO standard would be would give some credibility to the profession, and so decided from the start, in cooperation with BSI, to form this ISO committee, or propose the formation of the ISO committee, and has worked significantly to make sure that that activity has been successful. So why does PMI participate here? And is ISO competition to PMI standards? Well, in some respects, I think you could probably see it that way. But PMI feels that, again, having the ISO standard is a good thing, that it promotes the profession. And PMI would certainly not be fulfilling its responsibility towards the profession if it did not participate. And so PMI has been participating both in the ISO activity as well as working on PMI's own standards through internal standards development activities. Another reason that we participate in ISO is to work to make sure that our various standards are aligned. We don't want to increase the amount of confusion. As Miles has already pointed out, there are standards coming from different organizations, from PMI, from ISO, IPMA, and so forth. And even though they more or less say the same thing, they don't always perfectly agree with each other. And so PMI feels that it's to the advantage of the profession as a whole that the standards agree, that they're in alignment, that they're harmonized. A good example that I use on this quite often is that you can use 21500 together with the PMBOK guide, and they're well enough aligned, you can use them together on the same project. Now, in some cases, some of you may be required to use an ISO standard. Maybe your contract or the RFP requires that you use an international standard for the basis of your project. Fine, go ahead, use ISO 21500. But then at the same time, you can also use the PMBOK guide to provide some additional detail that you don't find in ISO 21500. So 21500 has the process groups, and then you can go to the PMBOK guide to find out some of the tools and techniques. And there goes my microphone again. I didn't touch it. Okay. So, what is it that we do? Am I back on? Okay. So, how does PMI participate? So I've been talking a lot about PMI participating in ISO. PMI participates on a number of different levels. In the first place, I'm PMI staff, and I act as secretary for the ISO TC. So in the ISO procedure, a country is named as the secretariat of the committee, and that country's responsibility is to provide the secretary and provide hosting and support and all those sorts of things. The secretariat for ISO TC 258 is ANSI, which is the US national body, and PMI has volunteered to take that role on behalf of ANSI, and then they've assigned me to do this job. So I'm working on behalf of PMI, on behalf of ANSI, as secretary of TC 258. So that's one area where PMI participates. PMI also hosts the U.S. National Committee, which in the U.S. is called the Technical Advisory Group, or TAG. So every country who is a member of the TC has a mirror committee. By mirror, I mean they have their own national local committee that mirrors or duplicates the activities of the international committee. So in Greece, the national body is ELAT. And they have a mirror committee, which is composed of a number of people whose responsibility is to decide what the national position is and bring that position back to the ISO committee. So in the case of the United States, PMI hosts that national committee. PMI is also a liaison to the committee. So an organization can be a liaison to a ISO committee. So in addition to countries being the members, they also have organizations that can work in liaison. And so the liaison organization can send a representative to represent that organization's perspective. So in this case, PMI also is able to send liaisons to represent PMI specifically. Now, some people may think that's a bit much, that PMI is providing the secretary and also hosting the US and is also sending liaisons. But the first two of those, the secretary, when I act as secretary, I must be neutral. I cannot represent a country's interests. I cannot represent an organization's interests, such as PMI. And the same with the US committee. PMI, as the host, cannot determine the US position. That's the job of the delegates or the members of the committee to determine the national position. So by sending a liaison, PMI is able to represent its technical interests in the committee. So PMI is participating in those three manners. Now, PMI has also recently begun forming a member advisory group around our ISO activity. This is a new development. Most of you should be familiar with member advisory groups at PMI. So the various activities at PMI put together committees of members to help advise and determine strategy and so forth. And so we've done the same thing with our ISO activity. So we're in the process of putting together a group of people who will advise PMI on what direction we should be taking with our activities at ISO, not just at 258, but also in other ISO committees, because there are other committees that work related to project management, and prioritize those activities and decide what the desired outcomes are. You know, what do we want 258 to do? What do we want 176 to do, and so forth. So those are the areas where PMI is participating in the ISO activity. So let me go through the ISO process again. Miles mentioned quickly, but I'll review again as well. The ISO members are the countries. So every country that wishes to participate can join. They have a mirror committee, and that mirror committee will then determine the national position and how the country would vote. They assign technical experts to represent the country's positions. If any of you in this room are interested in participating in the ISO TC, you may, but you need to go through ELAT to join up and to be named as a delegate. And then you can assist Theophanis in putting together the national position for Greece on the ISO activities. The technical committee is comprised of a number of work groups, as Miles has mentioned, either work groups or study groups, and each one of those is working on an individual standard. We go through various phases. We start with a working draft within the work group. We then send it up to the entire committee for the committee to respond, to review, and to ballot. And then from there, we go up to the broader international level of all ISO country members. So we go working draft, committee draft, draft international standard, and sometimes a final draft international standard if we need one more step. And each one of these phases has its own requirements and its own calendar and so forth. But that's all in a process document. It's my job to administer and make sure that we're following that process within the committee. Another note that I'd like to make is that over the last few years, ISO has been very interested in applying project management to the standards development process, which I think is a very good thing. Because, all of us here as project managers, we understand the advantages of applying project management to activities such as this. And development of a standard is a project, just like any other project. Maybe not quite so complex as building a large ship or a nuclear power plant, but still, we initiate, we plan, we execute, we control and monitor, we close out. Those are all important phases in standards development, just as anything else. ISO is very interested in seeing committees follow schedules more tightly and coming out with standards on schedule and producing quality work. And so they've decided that project management is a very good thing to be applied to the standards development activity. So I've worked with them to put together some training that has gone to all the secretaries of the various TCs. And I think at some point we may see also some rule changes, some changes made to the ISO directives to reflect project management. Not sure what yet might happen there, but I think sometime in the future we may see some changes. As far as TC 258, our responsibility is the scope around project program portfolio management. We also do other related topics as well. We meet every year as a plenary committee, so we'll be meeting next week here in Athens. And in addition to the plenary meeting, the individual work groups will meet as well. And then they also meet during the year on their own schedule, either face-to-face or virtually. So here's a list of our current activities. Miles has already reviewed these, so I'll go through them quickly. So portfolio management, we published a year or so ago. Year and a half ago. This is ISO 21504. And so this is guidance on management of portfolios. And we have governance, which is very close to completion. We expect that at the meeting next week, they will agree to send this off to ISO for publication. So this has been going on for a few years, and a bit of a rough start, but I think we're on our way, and we've got an excellent standard there. Vocabulary. This is a collection of the terms and definitions being used in various standards within TC 258. The goal here is harmonization, making sure that all of the documents that come out of TC 258 use the terms and the definitions in the same manner. So we're not causing any sort of confusion at all. Program management. This is also fairly far along. We should be looking at publication sometime next year. Now, 21500 maintenance. 21500 was published in 2012, and the ISO standard ISO directives require that ISO standards be revisited every 5 years. So every 5 years, you're supposed to go back and decide if the standard should be reaffirmed or continue to be published under the same with the same text, or if you want to revise it, if there are changes that are necessary, or perhaps you could either withdraw it. You could say that the standard is no longer necessary, or it's not being used, and so we can withdraw it. So we're required to look at those standards every 5 years, and so that's the process we're going through right now. We have a study group that is looking at how 21500 is being used, who is using it, and putting together a list of requirements for a possible future revision. And they're going to give us a preliminary report next week at our plenary meeting. And we expect that based on that preliminary report and some additional work that's scheduled, that a year from now they'll be able to give us some recommendations, and we'll start a work group to actually do the revision of 21500. And that would be based on how it's being used. What's the feedback from industry and from the countries? What do they feel about it? What's lacking? Do things need to be added? What changes need to be made? Are we reflecting the current practice out there in the profession and in the various industries? So all of those things need to be taken into account in keeping this standard up to date. So again, every 5 years revisit and decide how things need to be updated. A new activity around work breakdown structure, and also another one around earned value management. Both of those started early in the year, and they've met several times and making some good progress. And finally, also an activity around competencies. Off to a little bit slower start, but still some good activity there. So again, a reminder that anybody interested in participating in the ISO activity, you would need to contact LLUT. And I would encourage you to participate. ISO standards rely on broad participation, perspectives from many countries, many industries, and the more participation we have, the better the quality of the resulting work. So I think that's it for my slides. So thank you very much.